November the 2nd, 1943. Simpson Harbor, Rabaul, New Britain. The sea is a sheet of hammered steel, broken only by the white teeth of flak bursts and the dark shapes of Japanese warships. A low overcast hangs like a lid over the harbor, trapping the smoke, the thunder, and the smell of burning oil. At wave-top height, a formation of B-25 Mitchells comes roaring in, props blurred, engines at full power, bomb bay doors open. In the lead ship, the one taking the heaviest fire, Major Raymond H. Wilkins grips the control column so hard his knuckles ache. The nose of his B-25D, tail code A, slices through geysers of water thrown up by near misses. You are in the bombardier's seat with him, lying prone behind the plexiglass, watching a Japanese destroyer grow larger in the bomb sight with terrifying speed. This is the moment the mission planners warned them about. Simpson Harbor, the most heavily defended anchorage in the South Pacific. A fortress within a fortress, ringed by anti-aircraft guns, protected by fighter fields at Lakunai and Vunakanau, and packed today with warships that survived the previous night's battle off Empress Augusta Bay. Heavy cruisers like Myoko and Haguro, transports, auxiliaries, and smaller escorts crowd the harbor, their guns already stitching the sky with tracer. The B-25 bucks as shrapnel rips into the wings. In the interphone, someone swears, then laughs, a brittle edge of fear in the sound. Wilkins doesn't answer. He doesn't have time. His bomb run has to be straight, level, and deadly accurate at mast height. Any weave, any flinch, and the 1,000-pound bomb slung in his bay will walk off target, and the destroyer's guns will keep chewing his squadron apart. 3 hours earlier, just before dawn, the world had been quieter. Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. The jungle around the strip was still black when the wake-up call came at 0400. The men of the 8th Bombardment Squadron rolled out of their cots to the familiar ritual. Shave if you dared, choke down powdered eggs and coffee, then walk out to the flight line, where the B-25s sat in 2 neat rows, dark hulks beaded with tropical dew. It was the 3rd morning in a row they'd done this. Twice bad weather had scrubbed the mission at the last minute. Today, the sky above New Guinea was clear. Somewhere 300 miles to the northeast, over the Bismarck Sea, it was probably not. But the target was too important to ignore, and the Japanese had to believe they were safe in Rabaul. Major Ray Wilkins walked the line like he always did, checking bomb shackles, fuel caps, the faces of his crew. 26 years old, shorter than many of his pilots, he had the compact build of a man who'd grown up doing farm work in North Carolina, tempered by 7 straight campaigns in the Southwest Pacific. He'd joined the 3rd Bomb Group in Australia after his transport had been diverted from the Philippines in the chaos following Pearl Harbor, and he had flown just about every kind of mission the group could throw at him. A-24 dive bombers, low-level B-25 strikes, skip bombing, mast-height runs. By late 1943, he was the commander of the 8th, and one of the last of the old hands, the few who had been with the 3rd Bomb Group almost from the beginning and were still alive. 80-plus missions had carved early lines into his face, but in the dim glow of the pre-dawn lamps, he still moved with the quick, economical confidence of a man who knew his airplane and his job intimately. Inside the briefing hut, the air was dense with cigarette smoke and sweat. A big map of New Britain was pinned to the wall, red grease pencil circling Rabaul, and within it, Simpson Harbor. The intelligence officer tapped the board with a pointer as the men crowded closer. Heavy cruisers, Myoko and Haguro, confirmed in port. Destroyers, transports, submarine tenders. More guns than any sane man would fly into at 200 feet. "This is going to be rough," the briefer said, in the understatement of the war. Escorting P-38 Lightnings would try to hold off the Zeros, but the 5th Air Force had learned the hard way that Rabaul was no pushover. The last time they'd gone in low against shipping like this, losses had been brutal. Today would be worse. When it was his turn to speak, Wilkins stepped up without notes. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The 8th Bomb Squadron knew his voice as well as they knew the sound of their own engines. "Listen up," he said. "We're the last of the 3 squadrons to go in. That means they'll be good and mad by the time we get there. They'll be waiting." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room and died. "I've arranged the formation so my ship will take the worst of it," he went on. He pointed to the chalk diagram on the board, his B-25 in the lead element, the slot that would have to fly straight through the densest curtain of flak to mark the way. "Your job is to stick with me, hit your targets, then get the hell out. If somebody's going to catch it, it's going to be me first." It wasn't bravado. It was simple math. Someone would be closest to the guns. Better that it be the man with the most experience under fire, the one who trusted his own hands more than anyone else's. And if his presence out front gave his younger pilots a little courage, so much the better. He caught the eye of one of his lieutenants, fresh from the States, a kid who'd barely finished training before being hurled into this meat grinder. The lieutenant's jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle jumped in his cheek. Wilkins gave him a small nod. "You've all been trained for this. You know the drill. We go in low, we go in fast. We don't jink on the bomb runs. You hit what you're aiming at. We hurt them bad enough. They'll remember today for a long time." Questions? There weren't any that mattered. Outside, the sky was paling to grey as the B-25s taxied out. Wilkins climbed up through the nose hatch of his own aircraft, B-25D Fifi, serial 41303111, the airplane he'd flown so often it felt like an extension of his own body. The crew settled into their stations, co-pilot beside him, navigator and radio operator aft, top turret gunner ready to swing the twin 50s skyward at the first hint of fighters, tail gunner crouched in his cramped, drafty compartment. The engines coughed, then roared to life, filling the cockpit with vibration. The smell of hot oil and high-octane fuel flooded in as the chocks were pulled. Out beyond the Mitchells, you could see the silver flashes of P-38s from the 8th Fighter Group forming up, the long-legged escorts that would try to keep the Zeros off their backs over the target. Takeoff was a blur of noise and acceleration. Dobadura's pierced steel planking rattled under the wheels, then dropped away as the B-25s clawed into the warm morning air, heavy with fuel and bombs. They leveled off low, heading northeast, hugging the contours of the Owens-Stanley Range. Jungle ridges slid beneath them, green waves marching off to the horizon. For over an hour, they flew in relative quiet, the roar of engines and the occasional crackle of the interphone, their only companions. The crews knew what waited ahead. Many had relatives somewhere in the Pacific, on Bougainville, on New Georgia, on ships inching their way toward Japan. Rabaul was the thorn in the side of that whole advance, the Japanese stronghold that could still fling bombers and fighters at any Allied move in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Neutralizing it was the key to the next phase of the war. Somewhere along the line, the nickname Bloody Tuesday started on someone's tongue, a half-joking, half-resigned label for an attack they all knew could go very wrong. No one repeated it loudly. You didn't tempt fate that way. As they neared New Britain, the weather changed. Broken cumulus at 1,500 to 2,000 feet. Cloud shadows striping the sea. The formation dropped even lower, the altimeter needle settling around 50 to 100 feet. From up here, the sea smelled faintly of salt and fuel. From down where they were, it felt like you could reach out the window and skim your fingers along the wave tops. "Rabaul ahead!" the navigator called, voice tight. The jagged outline of New Britain's north coast rose from the sea, teeth of jungle-covered hills, and the humped shape of Matupi Island guarding the approaches to the harbour. Smoke already hung over the land, thick and black, evidence that the first two B-25 squadrons had hit their targets and drawn blood. Somewhere beyond that smoke, Japanese gunners were swinging their barrels seaward, waiting for the next wave. Wilkins thumbed his radio switch and spoke calmly, as if he were calling a routine turn in a training flight over Texas. 8 Squadron, this is lead. Tighten it up. We go in together. Follow me. The formation. Closed, wingtips riding in rough air above the swells, bomb bay doors opening like gaping mouths. Simpson Harbor lay just ahead, a basin of warships and steel and fire, and at the front of the American formation was one B-25 that would not turn away. The roar of 8 B-25s filled the low clouds as the formation crossed into the harbor's outer entrance. Below, the silhouettes of war vessels, transports, destroyers, a cruiser, lay clustered like sharks circling prey, hulks of metal bristling with AA guns, decks crowded with sailors, ready. As the first bombs from earlier squadrons detonated, their smoke rose in thick, choking columns, pressing the incoming 8th Squadron into a tighter, narrower funnel of exposure. For Wilkins, this was the moment his plan demanded. His B-25 Fifi cut through the gloomy harbour, flying the lead slot under near masthead height. His bomber shuddered under the first volley, tracers and flak tearing into wing and fuselage. Immediately, shrapnel peppered the right wing. Control was lost, but not entirely. The fabric of reality narrowed. His crew, his plane, his squadron's fate. But he held the column. Without a pause, Wilkins opened fire with his machine guns on a cluster of small harbour vessels, barges and supply boats that had no chance to escape. The crack of 50 cals and the roar of the B-25's engines harmonized into a brutal hymn of war. He then muscled his crippled bomber toward a Japanese destroyer. According to after-action accounts, the 1,000-pound bomb from Fifi struck squarely amidships. The destroyer erupted in flame and twisted metal. Stands of deck guns and superstructure collapsed, torched from within. The plane's strafing fire added to the chaos, setting smaller craft ablaze nearby. As the smoke from that explosion curled up, the B-25 lurched as more flak smashed into the left vertical stabilizer. The tail shuddered, but Wilkins refused to pull out. He had more to do. His plan, his duty, and his men depended on it. Turning deeper into the harbour, the bomber leveled on another target, a transport vessel, reportedly about 9,000 tons. Wilkins dropped what remained of his bombs, then delivered another strafing run. Flames roared along the deck, turning the transport into a blazing pyre. Its magazines, if not yet detonated, were surely sealed death traps for crew and any troops aboard. The shock of the explosion held for a heartbeat, long enough for the rest of the 8th Squadron to close in, bank away, begin their escape. Now bombs spent, the crippled B-25 struggled. The stabilizer was nearly gone. The aircraft flexed dangerously under every control input. Then a challenge. A heavy cruiser lay directly on the line of escape. Its 6-inch and 8-inch guns, trained on the outgoing formation, would tear any trailing or straggling bomber to pieces. Wilkins looked at his instruments, at his crew, and made a decision no sane man but a hero could have made. He aimed Fifi at the cruiser and dove in. At near zero altitude, he began a strafing run. The cruiser's decks blazed with anti-aircraft fire. Pieces of metal and fire shredded the battered stabilizer, then punched into the outer left wing. The structure began to break apart under the stress. According to the official citation, the left wing crumpled, control was lost entirely, and Fifi rolled, inverted, then plunged into the waters of Simpson Harbor. The wounded bomber, its pilot, co-pilot, navigator, gunners, vanished into the sea, swallowed by oil, fire, and water. In those final moments, Wilkins' sacrifice bought precious minutes and safe passage for the rest of his squadron. Planes trailing behind banked away, raced for open water, and escaped the harbor under covering fire. Every one of them alive. That grim tally would later be one of the reasons Wilkins was awarded the highest military honor. In the hollow quiet that followed, the burning silhouettes of Japanese vessels smoldered in the harbor's smoky gloom, a testament to what one man's resolve and one bomber-turned-weapon of reckoning could achieve. When dawn finally broke over the sea beyond Matupi Island, the full cost of the mission was painfully clear. Of the 75 B-25s that had attacked Rabaul that day, part of a massive coordinated strike by the 5th Air Force, many did not return. According to contemporary accounts of the November 2nd attack on Simpson Harbor, about 21 U.S. aircraft were lost, and 28 men listed as missing in action, with 7 confirmed killed, among them Major Wilkins. The Japanese tally was grim, too. Transports, small vessels, a destroyer destroyed, others damaged, some heavily. The transport Wilkins hit burned out, the destroyer he bombed exploded. Some Japanese ships limped away, but their presence, their perceived invincibility, was shattered. For the Allies, Rabaul had been punched. The anchor that threatened advances in the Solomons and New Guinea had been dented. For the men of the 8th Bombardment Squadron, it was the last B-25 mission. The squadron would not fly another daylight low-level attack after that day. The cost had been too high. Back among the green tents and rough wooden huts of Dobadura and other New Guinea fields, the mood was somber. Where before there had been jokes, cigarette breaks, the grunts and groans of tired flyers, now there was silence. The pilots who returned carried with them the weight of loss, comrades, a leader, a friend, and the memory of Fifi, torn to pieces, resting somewhere in the murky harbor depths. After the war, Wilkins' sacrifice was recognized, even if his body was never recovered. On 24th of March 1944, the War Department posthumously awarded him the Medal of Honor, its citation underscoring his selfless decision to place himself in the worst position so that his men might escape. It was a stark, tragic heroism. 1 bomber, 1 pilot, 2 sunk ships, a squadron saved. The strike on Simpson Harbor on 2nd November 1943, sometimes known among Allied crews as Bloody Tuesday, was not a reckless gamble. It was a carefully planned, brutally executed blow. The operation formed part of a broader strategy by 5th Air Force to neutralize the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul without risking a ground invasion. Land-based heavy and medium bombers had pounded Japanese airfields for months. The November raid added shipping, the arteries of Japanese resupply, to the target list. What made the mission especially dangerous was the concentration of warships. Heavy cruisers, destroyers, transports, tenders, nestled inside a natural harbor ringed by hills bristling with anti-aircraft batteries. To succeed, attackers had to fly low, fast, and with terrifying precision, under a hail of fire from guns on water and on land. The escorting fighters could do little once the Mitchells dove in among the ships themselves. That's where the leadership of Wilkins mattered most. As commanding officer of the 8th Bombardment Squadron, Light, part of the 3rd Bombardment Group, he deliberately placed his own aircraft in the slot, most likely to take hits, shielding younger, less experienced crews behind him. His willingness to lead from the front, to be the first through the gate, transformed a suicidal mission into a tactical blow that achieved real results. Furthermore, his final act, diving toward a heavy cruiser to draw its fire, speaks to a rare and terrible clarity under fire. The cruiser's guns threatened every bomber still in the air. Wilkins aimed Fifi at them, becoming a sacrificial shield. The broken stabilizer and crumpled wing were testament not to a lucky escape, but to a lethal, deliberate choice. In a strategic sense, the destruction of Japanese shipping, or at least the damage and the terror inflicted, helped to begin the isolation of Rabaul. Over the next weeks and months, repeated airstrikes, submarine blockades, and naval actions relegated Rabaul to a vassal stronghold, important on maps, but impotent in action. The supply lines the Japanese had once relied on were severed. Forward airfields lost their lifeline. Their ability to project naval power into the Solomons and New Guinea diminished. The strike in which Wilkins lost his life was one of the critical early blows in that campaign. For the men who escaped Simpson Harbor on November 2, 1943, the mission did not end when the last bombs fell, or when the last Japanese cruiser rolled smoke across the scalded water. Their return journey was as much a battle as the one they had just survived. Engines coughed, control surfaces fluttered like torn fabric. Hydraulic pressure bled away. Cockpits smelled of fire extinguishers, adrenaline, and something darker, the copper tang of blood from shrapnel wounds the men were only beginning to feel. The moment they cleared the harbors, the air changed. The towering walls of flak that had surrounded them like a burning cage fell behind, replaced by the rolling openness of the Bismarck Sea. The men looked back, some through cracked plexiglass, some through gunners' blister windows, some through holes punched into fuselages by Japanese guns. They saw fire. They saw columns of smoke rising from ships that moments earlier had been unassailable steel titans. They saw the great harbor, the Japanese bastion feared for 2 years, torn open by 8 men in a single bomber who had chosen to stay too long, fly too low, and draw too much fire so that they could live. Every man who looked back that day carried away the same image, a patch of churning black water where Major Raymond H. Wilkins and his B-25 had vanished. No survivors, no debris, nothing afloat. Just an expanding ring of oil rainbowed across the surface, flames licking at it as if hungry for more. The younger pilots, those who had only trained stateside, those who had not yet learned what sacrifice in the Pacific truly meant, said nothing on the radio. Their voices failed them. Some later admitted their hands shaking so violently on the yoke that the co-pilot had to briefly take over. But they were alive. That fact alone, life, was the gift Wilkins had bought them in his final moments. As the Mitchells clawed for altitude, they expected fighters. Rabaul was infamous for its zero squadrons, but the low-level chaos inside Simpson Harbor had disrupted Japanese coordination. By the time fighters scrambled, the B-25s were already threading their way into cloud banks. Their escorting P-38s rejoined them in loose, battered formation. The radio crackled with disbelief as pilots confirmed how many Mitchells still lived. Most of them. More than intelligence officers had dared hope. More than logic had allowed. The flight back to New Guinea was long. 2.5 hours of silence, pain, and the lingering echo of what they had left behind. Crewmen patched bullet holes with whatever they could find. Maps, flight jackets, even torn strips from emergency kits. Some gunners slumped over, exhaustion claiming them after emptying every round they carried. One plane flew so low, its pilot skimmed waves just to keep airflow over his shredded horizontal stabilizer. Another had a top turret jammed in place, useless after a lucky fragment severed the operating linkage. One crew counted more than 200 holes in their fuselage by the time they landed, yet they made it. One by one, the wheels kissed the Dobadura runway, kicking up brown dust. Mechanics and medics swarmed them before engines even spooled down. Some men staggered out under their own strength. Others had to be helped, weaving like wounded animals. Their uniforms were soaked in sweat, grime, and oil, their eyes reddened by smoke and wind, but alive. The first question every returning airman asked, even before food, even before water, was the same. Did Wilkins' ship come in? No, it hadn't. And all of them knew, even before hearing it, that it would not. Word spread fast through the third bomb group. Pilots not on the mission gathered quietly around the operations tent, the looks on their faces carving themselves into memory. Some were veterans of Buna, Wewak, and the Bismarck Sea, hardened men who had seen much, lost much, and yet the loss of Wilkins carved a deeper wound than most. He hadn't been just a commander. He had been the anchor of the 8th Squadron, the man who never let fear see daylight, the one who could talk a terrified replacement through his first low-level run as calmly as if he were giving driving directions. A young lieutenant, the same one Wilkins had locked eyes with in the briefing hut, punched the side of a fuel truck until his knuckles split. Another sat on an overturned ammo crate and stared at nothing, his face blank. The squadron's flight surgeon moved through the men with a quiet professionalism that barely masked his own grief. Inside the debriefing hut, heat pooled under the tin roof. The air was thick with sweat and silence. The intelligence officers waited, pencils poised, as the surviving crews filed in. None of the pilots removed their flight gear immediately. They sat down, still strapped with harnesses hanging loose, their faces lined with exhaustion and disbelief. The first pilot to speak in the debrief tried to start with technical detail, altitude, time over target, wind direction, but his voice cracked. The recording clerk didn't write that down. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew what he was trying to hold back. Eventually, piece by piece, the story came out. How Wilkins held the throttle steady, even with his tail nearly shot off. How he refused to break off his run, despite losing half his control surface. How he kept firing, kept strafing, kept pushing deeper into the harbor when every other pilot knew he should have turned away. How his attack on the destroyer was so close, the blast rocked their own Mitchells. How he alone turned against the heavy cruiser to draw fire away from the rest. How the cruiser's guns concentrated on him like a living organism recognizing its greatest threat. How the left wing buckled inward. How the bomber flipped. How the sea swallowed him whole. No hesitation, no panic, no cry on the radio. Just a final act of leadership few men would ever witness in their lives. When the debrief ended, the room remained still. Officers dismissed the crews, but nobody moved for several seconds. When they did stand, it was slow, like men rising from a funeral bench. That night, long after the sun had fallen, and the jungle around Dobodura buzzed with insects and the distant rumble of occasional artillery or thunder, the pilots of the 8th gathered outside the tent they used as an officers' club. It wasn't much. Boards hammered together for a bar, a few crates for seating, lanterns hung, from string, but it had been theirs. They drank little. Mostly they talked. Not about the mission itself, that would come later. Instead, they spoke about Wilkins, about his habit of showing up early at the flight line, walking past every nose art painting, with a grin as if each one were a personal gift, about the way he read weather reports like a gambler watching dice spin, about the small tin cross he kept tucked into his flight jacket, or the letter he wrote to his mother every week without fail, even if it had to be dictated to a crewman during a long flight. Someone mentioned that Wilkins had flown more than 80 missions. Someone else corrected him. 86, possibly 87. There were differing counts because he often volunteered to take the place of sick or exhausted pilots, slipping into the lead seat as effortlessly as stepping through a doorway. One man recalled a night over New Guinea when a squadron mate had nearly flown into a mountainside during a storm. Wilkins had talked him through the clouds, calm and clear, until the man emerged to see the moon glinting off the sea. Another remembered a joke Wilkins repeated before every mission, bad, predictable, barely worth a smile, but one that lightened the mood every time. He had been more than a leader. He had been a shield, a teacher, a brother. In the following days, the effects of the Simpson Harbor raid rippled far beyond Dobodura. Intelligence reports filtered in through the Pacific Command structure. Multiple Japanese ships confirmed sunk or heavily damaged, supply operations disrupted, reinforcements delayed. Observers scanning Rabaul noted changes in Japanese naval movements, fewer departures, more defensiveness, cautious tactics replacing the aggressive thrusts of earlier months. The attack on November 2nd had not crippled Rabaul alone, but it had struck a blow at its heart. Combined with the heavy bomber raids that preceded and followed it, the harbor was becoming a graveyard of opportunity for Japan. American commanders took notice. General George Kenney himself, architect of 5th Air Force's relentless offensive, made a point of recognizing the extraordinary bravery of the low-level B-25 crews. Privately, he acknowledged that without men like Wilkins, the campaign to isolate Rabaul might have stalled. But inside the 3rd Bomb Group, none of that mattered yet. To them, the success of the mission could not soften the loss of the man who had led them into the crucible and never returned. Official confirmation arrived that Wilkins would be recommended for the Medal of Honor. Some men nodded quietly, as if acknowledging a truth that needed no paperwork. Others had expected it the moment they watched his bomber dive toward the cruiser. Pilots who had flown beside him wrote letters home, describing what they saw, though many toned down the violence, not wanting to send full horror to American front porches. But the truth moved through the ranks. Wilkins had performed not one act of heroism, but a series of them, each one escalating until the final, fatal moment. The phrase someone uttered during a late-night gathering became the unofficial eulogy for Major Raymond H. Wilkins. He didn't die trying to survive the mission. He died guaranteeing that we would. No one contested it, because it was the truth. Behind the scenes, the squadron's officers made decisions they wished they never had to make. A replacement commander was appointed, quietly, reluctantly. New pilots were assigned to fill empty roster slots. The battered Mitchells were patched, refueled, and prepared for whatever target would rise next on the briefing board. That was the war's cruelty. It did not stop for grief. It did not pause for mourning. It did not give the 8th Squadron a moment's peace. Yet something had changed. A hard, invisible line had been drawn in the hearts of the surviving airmen. They carried Wilkins' presence with them into every cockpit, every throttle push, every bomb release. The young lieutenant whom Wilkins had nodded to before takeoff later explained it best. He didn't fly in the next plane with us, but he flew in every one after. For the rest of the New Guinea campaign, the spirit of Wilkins lived in every man who had watched him give his life. The squadron that returned from Simpson Harbor did not return the same, but they returned stronger in ways they would only understand years later. Wilkins had not only saved their lives, he had defined their reason to fight. In the weeks that followed the raid on Simpson Harbor, the war surged forward with its usual merciless rhythm. New targets were assigned, new briefings held, new crews arrived, nervous and unsure, to replace those who had vanished into the sea. The 3rd Bomb Group continued its relentless campaign in New Guinea, but something had shifted within the 8th Squadron. They carried themselves differently now, not with bravado, not with swagger, but with a quiet, steel-edged resolve that outsiders immediately noticed. Every man who had flown with Wilkins spoke of feeling him beside them. not as a ghost, not as a superstition, but as an instinct sharpened by the memory of his courage. When turbulence rattled their wings, they held steady. When enemy fire reached for their cockpits, they did not flinch. When a bomb run demanded nerves of iron, they delivered, because they had witnessed the standard of bravery, and it was impossible to forget. To the new pilots who arrived fresh from the States, the veterans tried to explain the story of November 2nd, but words always fell short. They could describe the wall of flak, the roar of the destroyer exploding beneath Fifi, the monstrous profile of the heavy cruiser looming ahead. But until a pilot felt the wind shear at 50 feet over enemy ships, until he saw tracers reaching for him like claws, he could never truly grasp what Wilkins had done. Some nights, those who had been there told the story again, or pieces of it, around a lantern-lit table in the officer's tent. Each retelling was not an exercise in grief, but in preservation. They needed others to know. They needed the legend to grow, because the man could not. One such night, the air was thick with humidity. The jungle hummed. A handful of pilots sat around, sweat-stained flight jackets thrown over chairs. A replacement pilot, quiet and respectful, listened as the veterans spoke. When the story was finished, he asked softly, if he knew the plane was coming apart, why didn't he turn away? The answer came from a sergeant gunner, who normally said little. He stared at the table as he replied, because the rest of us weren't away yet. It became the simplest, most accurate explanation of the sacrifice made in Simpson Harbor. Back in the United States, news traveled more slowly. Wilkins' family in North Carolina received a telegram first, official, stiff, printed with the impersonal precision of wartime notification. It said that Major Raymond H. Wilkins had been killed in action in New Britain. No details, no story. Just the cold announcement that a son, a brother, a friend would not return. Weeks later, another letter arrived, this one written by hand. It came from one of the surviving pilots of the 8th Squadron. He explained what words could scarcely capture, that Wilkins had saved the formation, that the mission's success had hinged on his choices, that dozens of men breathed because he had chosen not to. Wilkins' mother read the letter more than a dozen times. She kept it on her nightstand for the rest of her life. The country did not know his name yet, but in the jungle airstrips of New Guinea, it was spoken with reverence. In early 1944, the paperwork that passed through 5th Air Force headquarters finally reached Washington. Witness statements, squadron reports, mission summaries, all describing the same extraordinary sequence of events. The Medal of Honor nomination went forward. To the pilots who had flown with him, the medal did not elevate the story. It merely acknowledged it officially. They had seen heroism in its rawest form, unpolished, unscripted, and terrifying to behold. No medal could enhance that memory. The citation, when finalized, told the story with military brevity. It spoke of courage, leadership, and self-sacrifice. It described the attacks on the destroyer and transport. It detailed the final strafing run on the cruiser that cost Wilkins his life. It acknowledged that he had placed himself deliberately in the most dangerous position so that his men could survive. But the citation could not capture the trembling in a pilot's hands as he watched Fifi roll and plunge. It could not describe the way an entire squadron leaned forward in terror during the debrief when recounting his last seconds. It could not show the face of the young lieutenant who still heard the sound of Wilkins' bomber breaking apart in his sleep months later. History records facts, memory records truth, and the memory was far more powerful. By the time the Medal of Honor was awarded on March 24, 1944, the war had moved on to new islands, new battles, new sacrifices. Bougainville, Cape Gloucester, Hollandia, Saipan, names that soaked up headlines and attention. Yet in the third bomb group, the pilots of the 8th Squadron paid close attention to the ceremony held far across the sea. They imagined Wilkins' mother holding the star-shaped medal with trembling hands, the blue ribbon draped across her palms. They hoped she understood what her son had done, not just for them, but for the war's wider path. His sacrifice ensured the destruction of Japanese shipping at a time when every sunk vessel mattered. His attack disrupted Japanese plans, slowed reinforcements, and weakened the stronghold of Rabaul at a key moment. His death helped isolate one of the Pacific's most powerful fortresses, hastening its slide from menace to irrelevance. For the men who had been there, the medal was simply an affirmation of the truth they already lived with. No pilot, no commander, no man in their experience had ever done more. Months later, after the Solomons were secured and the Bismarck Sea contested no longer, American war correspondents visited airfields across New Guinea. Some asked about the legendary November 2nd raid. They expected stories of tactics, aircraft performance, Japanese defenses. What they received instead were stories of Wilkins. One correspondent, after speaking with half a dozen pilots, wrote in his notes, "I have never heard men speak of a commander in such a way. They do not describe him as a superior officer, but as the embodiment of their will to survive." He did not publish that line. It was too personal, too raw, but he kept it in his journal. The squadron had been through much before Wilkins fell, and would go through much after, but his story stood apart, a turning point in morale and identity. They no longer flew as individuals. They flew as a legacy in motion. The war dragged on into 1944 and 1945. Some of the pilots who had survived Rabaul eventually rotated home. Others flew on, transferring to new airfields as Allied forces leapfrogged westward across the Pacific. Losses continued. Replacements came. Squadrons changed, merged, reorganized. The faces in group photographs shifted year by year. Yet the story of Major Wilkins remained constant. New pilots heard the tale not from books or briefings, but from the men who had lived it. They passed it down like a torch, as if afraid the light would go out if left untold. Even years later, at reunions long after the war, the veterans spoke of Simpson Harbor with the same reverence, the same heavy silence, the same pride in what their commander had done. Some could barely speak of it without their voices trembling. Others found strength in describing the courage they had witnessed. But all agreed on one thing. Had Wilkins not taken the actions he did, the 8th Squadron would have been shattered in the harbor that day. One pilot, decades later, said during an interview, "I didn't survive because I was good. I survived because Ray Wilkins was brave." In the Pacific Theater's grand mosaic, countless acts of bravery were performed. Ships went down fighting, infantry charged into fire, pilots flew missions that seemed impossible. But among those countless stories, certain ones stood out, not because they were more heroic, but because they defined the soul of their unit. The story of Wilkins was such a story. It was the moment the 8th Squadron realized the weight of leadership born not of rank, but of example. It was the moment courage became contagious. It was the moment the war, with all its horror and sacrifice, revealed what a single human being could endure for the sake of others. History books write of tonnage sunk, enemy ships destroyed, tactical effects. They record that a destroyer and transport were destroyed that day and that a cruiser was damaged, but they do not feel the fear when the tracer rounds carved red scars across the water. They do not feel the vibration of a failing B-25 holding itself together on will alone. They do not feel the breath catch in a gunner's throat as he watched a man choose death so he could live. The men of the 8th Squadron felt all of it, and they never forgot. Years later, long after Japanese surrender, long after the tropical airstrips were abandoned to vines and silence, long after the roar of the Wright Cyclone engines faded into history, the veterans of the 8th came together one final time. They were older now, stooped and silver-haired, but their eyes, the ones that had once stared into the blazing heart of Simpson Harbor, still held that same fierce clarity. At the gathering, someone brought out a framed photograph of Major Wilkins. Black and white, clean uniform, steady gaze. They set it in the center of the table. No speeches were prepared. None were needed. The men simply raised their glasses, some with hands that shook from age, some with hands that still bore shrapnel scars, and paid their respects. One pilot leaned forward, resting his fingers against the frame. "You saved us," he whispered. "We never stopped flying with you." Around him heads nodded. Words failed. Time, distance, and age could not soften the memory. The photograph remained on the table long after the men drifted to their rooms, a still reminder of a man whose last moments burned more brightly than most men's entire lives. Today, the wreckage of Fifi still lies somewhere beneath the waves of Simpson Harbor, unrecovered, unmarked, unseen. Ships come and go above it. Tourists walk the shores, not knowing what rests below. The jungle on New Britain grows thick again, around old gun placements. The war slowly dissolves into the silence of time, but the water remembers. And the men who lived because Wilkins did not, they remembered until their last breath. His story is not merely one of valor. It is a story of duty carried to its absolute end, a story of a pilot who chose the worst position so his men might reach home, a story of courage so fierce it cast a light over an entire squadron, a story of sacrifice that still echoes across the Pacific. Major Raymond H. Wilkins did not survive Simpson Harbor. But Simpson Harbor did not survive him either, and neither did the war.